Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to Zellerbach Hall and Cal Performances for this afternoon's performance by the Czech Philharmonic and Prague Philharmonic Choir of Dvořák Stabat Mater. My name is Matthias Tarnopolsky. I'm the director of Cal Performances. We are collaborating with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music this week. The San Francisco Conservatory of Music is leading the Stephen and Cynthia Rubin Institute for Music Criticism, which has brought students from around the country together with many of the leading critics of publications, print and otherwise, from around the United States of America for a multi-day symposium exploring ideas around thinking and writing about music. It is without exaggeration that those of us involved have met the future, our future music critics. Ever the democratic community, the Bay Area, we are also inviting audiences to take part in the Stephen and Cynthia Rubin Institute for Music Criticism by submitting your own reviews in something called Everyone's a Critic. So when you've railed at the newspaper, today's your chance. So there's instructions in your program book on how to submit your own criticism of today's concert, and if selected by a distinguished panel of critics, including San Francisco's very own Joshua Kosman, the winning critique could win a $1,000 prize. So there's an incentive. Audiences at other events have been invited to apply. Audiences at the San Francisco Opera, the San Francisco Symphony, and the Philharmonia Baroque. I think it would be really fitting if Berkeley audiences submitted more reviews than any of those. So, because I know you're not short on opinions, so I encourage you. It gives me, there's one more speaker before our really distinguished speaker today, John Rockwell, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the person who will be introducing John Rockwell, and that is my friend and colleague, David Stull, who is the president of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to have all of you here, and it's wonderful to bring the Rubin Institute to Berkeley. I have to say that this has been an exciting week for us, but upon my arrival in San Francisco, one of the most impressive things I have seen is the work at Cal Performances. It is one thing to spend your time bringing artists to a campus, and it's another entirely to really offer a series of ingenious programming. Matthias and the team here has put together a fantastic array of artists, and the collaboration between the Conservatory and Berkeley now allows great performances here and also wonderful master classes for us. So I'd like to thank Matthias very much for that work. I'd also like to say that we have a distinguished group of critics. We have students from Cal, of course, Stanford, Oberlin, Yale, SFCM, all with us as young critics. We have a great panel of critics as well, as you will see in your program. But this all came about through the vision and direct financial support of one person, and it's an individual who really believes that discourse in music not only matters, but it must happen at the highest level. So I'd also like to recognize Steve Rubin and thank him for his support of this program. And now it is my great privilege to introduce somebody who's a real underachiever, this guy, really. So after attending Phillips Exeter Academy and Harvard, he came to UC Berkeley, as a matter of fact, to complete his studies, began his work as a critic at the Oakland Tribune, then to the LA Times. Following that in '72, he went to work for the New York Times as a classical music critic. But John knows no bounds to what he is capable of and does exceedingly well. And he also became the popular music for the Times, the popular music critic, and ultimately the dance critic years later. But during the interim, he He became the European cultural correspondent for the New York Times, came back to New York, and then ran brilliantly as the director of the Lincoln Center Festival as well, finally returning to the Times as editor of the Sunday Arts and Leisure section. In his spare time, he wrote several books, two of which I'll point out to you, All-American Music and Sinatra, an American Classic, which have become definitive in the field. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome John Rockwell.
David didn't mention, but my doctoral dissertation, my degree here, was in German cultural history, which informs what I'm going to talk to you about today. If you were expecting a bar-by-bar preview of the Dvořák Stabat Mater, which I will mention in the course of this talk, but I refer you to the program notes. The Roman Empire, I'm going back here to basic. The Roman Empire cast a very long shadow onto Europe. You could argue it still does. And in the middle of the second millennium, a large and unwieldy entity squatted in the middle of Europe called the Holy Roman Empire, which had an emperor known as the Kaiser, which is Caesar, and which was not a real country because there were a gazillion fractious principalities, some of which got quite annoyed at each other, for example, during the 30 Years' War. But they were all sort of vaguely bound. These little principalities ranged from larger ones like Prussia to small ones that you could barely fit on your fingernail. And they had various princelings and kings and so forth who ran them and who didn't particularly like the idea of being bound into a single empire, Holy Roman or otherwise. By into the 18th or 19th century, this Habsburg Empire, which had at one point included Spain, cf. Verdi's Don Carlo, and the Netherlands, cf. also Verdi's Don Carlo, had shrunk, if that's the word, to a multinational empire centered in Vienna. And by multinational, multicultural, I meant it included Hungarians. At one point, it became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It also included the Czechs and the Slovaks, the Czechs being divided into Sudetans, Moravians, and Bohemians, and other non-German speaking nationalities. This, as nationalism rippled through Europe, bearing in mind, that there was no unified Italy or Germany until around 1870. And so a lot of people wanted to have their own countries. It was sort of like the tribal fractions of today. So the Habsburg, Austro and then Austro-Hungarian Empire of the Habsburgs eventually was centered in Vienna with a strong sub-capital in Budapest. Now, since Dvořák was Czech, I'm concentrating here on the Czech side of the nationalism. Prague was the capital of Czechoslovakia or of Bohemia Moravia, but it was largely, or often in its upper cultural realms, a German-speaking city. C.F. Franz Kafka, who spent his life in Prague and who was nonetheless a German writer, and there are many others. And interestingly, the Salzburg Festival, this is kind of a footnote, was founded in 1919, I think, after the First World War by a bunch of people, Germans, Richard Strauss, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Franz Schalk, and others, Alfred Roller, who in some ways wanted to recreate the image of the multinational cultural entity that they nostalgically regard the Austro-Hungarian Empire to have been. However, in the late 19th century, it wasn't quite so smooth sailing in the sense that a lot of these non-German speaking entities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire resented the German hegemony. And the Germans, in turn, although happy to rule an empire that included all these lesser peoples, nonetheless had a considerable degree of cultural arrogance and superiority. They regarded Czech music as sweet but sort of simply folkish, Italian music as lacking in Germanic seriousness, meaning contrapuntal rigor, and so forth. And so a lot of this, just by the way, is another footnote. Leon Botstein, the president of Bard and determined conductor, is not always admired in all his capacities, but one thing Leon Botstein can really do well is cultural historical essays on musical subjects. And his lead essay, every year they do the Bard Music Festivals devoted to one composer in his ambience, or her, but I don't know if they've ever had a her. And the one that came out about 20 years ago, it must have been, was Dvořák and his world. And there's a lead essay in there by Botstein about some of these issues, the Czech versus German cultural tensions and so forth, which, if you are interested in this subject, is really worth seeking out. Antonín Dvořák was born in 1841. He died in Prague in 1904, except for his runouts to New York and other places. He lived in Prague his whole life, resisting the urgings of his powerful musical friends in Vienna to move to Vienna, which they thought would help his career. At the time, and in retrospect, Dvořák is probably regarded as the most important Czech composer, except for maybe Janacek. But his big rival in terms of critical attention, at least in the first few decades after his death, was Smetana. Smetana was more of a Wagnerian than Dvořák. I mean, Dvořák passed through a youthful Wagnerian phase in the late 60s and early 70s, but was essentially a Brahmsian. And he's basically regarded as a conservative in relationship to a kind of folkish, tuneful, overly tuneful conservative, according to his detractors. However, Botstein, interestingly, argues that there was a secret nationalist agenda within Dvořák's music, which he calls it, covert concessions masking overt rebellion. Now, whether this is true or not, there's a lot of weird stuff in Leon's essays, such as the fact that Dvořák's music in the later years was profoundly influenced by photography and trains. Don't know whether that's true, but it's an interesting idea. But through his life, Dvořák was a loyalist to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was also a sincere Czech nationalist. Among other things, he spoke Czech better than Smetana did. And he, as I said, stayed in Prague, and there were intermittent folkish elements throughout his career, from the earlier Slavonic dances to the later tone poems. The Stabat Mater was sketched out and basically composed, except for the orchestration and so forth, in 1875-6. And it is, to my ears at least, hard to detect much in the way of folkish elements in this. This is Dvořák loved choral music. He wrote 10 or 11 major choral works, and this was an early one, and it really sounds like something out of Mendelssohn or Brahms. It really comes out of the German Romantic choral tradition. And as such, that explains why Dvořák was particularly popular in England, which has a love for choral music, and Mendelssohn's in particular. What happened right after he finished the initial composition of the Stabat Mater, however, is that he met Brahms. He'd had dealings with Brahms earlier because he'd entered a competition awarding prizes for promising young composers, and he won it 3 or 4 years in a row. And finally, through the urging of Eduard Hanslick, the famous anti-Wagnerian, pro-Brahmsian dean of Viennese critics, Hanslick urged Dvořák to make contact with Brahms, and he did, in letters which just reek of obsequiousness. It's amazing. But he went and visited Brahms, and they hit it off immediately, and the obsequiousness drained away from his letters. And in later years, they were really semi-co-equal friends, although Brahms was considerably older. This whole thing of well-known younger composers going to visit older composers, impressing them and getting huge boosts in their careers, was a replication of Brahms's own visit to Schumann a generation before, and Schumann's push on to Brahms' career. In any case, Brahms was extremely helpful, hooked up Dvořák with his own publisher, Simrock, and his international career was born, especially after the premiere of the Stabat Mater. The Stabat Mater is, it's a poem attributed to a 13th century monk, who knows, but in any event, about the weeping mother at the foot of the Christ having been crucified. And Dvořák had a particular impetus in the reworking of the Stabat Mater after his initial composition when 2 of his children died in unfortunate but utterly unrelated circumstances. He finally finished the orchestration. The Stabat Mater received its world premiere in Prague in 1880. Curiously enough, the second performance in Brno was conducted by Leos Janáček. But in any case, and the Stabat Mater went all over Europe and was a big, big deal. The only other thing I will say about the Stabat Mater is that, it's a very beautiful piece of music, as you will hear, and it's, for a tragic situation, to wit, weeping mother at the foot of the cross, it's you might think curiously upbeat and cheerful. 4 of the 10 movements are in major keys. Only the first and last movement have any real thematic interconnectiveness. It's more lyrical effusions, which of course plays into the hands of those critics who felt, some of them German, who felt that Brahms was more of a fecund lyricist than a Beethoven-like worker out of themes. Brahms himself was a little concerned about his lack of melodic inventiveness, and so therefore was maybe a little jealous of Dvořák's easy facility with that. Nonetheless, it is very beautiful, and I think you will find that to be true. But the Germans, as I said, were a proud and cultural-centric race. It may have been a multinational empire, but German was the primary language, and German music was the primary musical utterance. Dvořák is an overt Catholic. Mind you, Austria and southern Germany are Catholic too, but a middle-class guy, overt Catholic, and then he developed this peculiar fascination with America, came to New York in the 1890s, was interested in black and Native American music, believed that folk music was a basis of a possible birth of serious American music, and all of this caused him to drift a little bit from Brahms. On the other hand, he was a pallbearer at Brahms's funeral, and they remained close all of Brahms's life. Now, changing gears ever so slightly, there is in Prague a concert hall called the Rudolfinum, which is very beautiful. And it was opened in 1885 as a multi-hall complex. And in it, the Czech Philharmonic gave its first concert in 1896, conducted by Antonín Dvořák in a program that included the New World Symphony. The Czech Philharmonic itself was born out of the Prague National Theatre Orchestra, but it became independent in 1891. In the course of, after this inaugural concert and after Dvořák's death, the primary conductor of this orchestra was Václav Talík, who was a famous Czech conductor in that era. Now we crank ahead in our quick historical overview to World War I, which, as you'll recall, the German side lost. And as a result of that, the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up. And as a result of that, Czechoslovakia became an independent country. And in, I believe, 1919, and the Rudolfinum Concert Hall was transformed into the house of, the lower house of the Chamber of Deputies of the new Czech Republic, losing its status as a concert hall. We now move along to 1938, and Adolf Hitler is shaking the bars of his cage and claiming he needed Lebensraum and that the Sudeten Germans in northern Czechoslovakia were being oppressed by the Czechs. And eventually what happened in 1938-39 was that Hitler incorporated the Sudetenland into Germany. He'd already taken over Austria. In other words, the large German solution proposed in 1870, whereby Austria would somehow join up with Germany, had foundered on maybe on the egos of the Hohenzollern versus the Habsburg monarchs, but also by the multinational nature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In any case, Hitler had taken over Austria in 38. He took over the Sudetenland in 38. And in 39, he pressured the already pro-Nazi government of Czechoslovakia to establish a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which in turn was supposed to be autonomous, but very soon became a Nazi sort of province, which was forced labor for the war effort and all that sort of stuff. In September of 1941, a rather horrible man, handsome in an Aryan sort of way, but horrible, named Reinhard Heydrich, became Reichsprotektor, meaning, Reichs protector of this protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Now, like so many bad Nazis, Heydrich, who had been a major organizer of Kristallnacht in 1937, who had set up the SS Sonderkommando to wipe out inferior peoples throughout Eastern. He was a bad guy and eager to ship off Jews to Theresienstadt or Terezin. They hadn't really got Birkenau up and running by the time he was out of the picture, but the guy was a bad guy. But like so many of them, he really liked music. Adolf Hitler liked music. And one of the things he did, Heydrich, was to reconvert the Rudolfinum back into a concert hall. It was meant in 41, I think, or maybe early 2. It was meant to be a home for a newly established German symphony orchestra, which in turn was part of a larger Nazi plan to essentially squish out Czech culture and reestablish German culture as the dominant, if not sole, culture of this part of the world. In any event, so it did become a concert hall again, and interestingly, one of the best known of all Czech mid-20th century conductors, Raphael Kubelik, conducted the Czech Philharmonic from 1941 to 1948 in the Rudolfinum. Somehow, and I think most people think Kubelik was a good guy when it came to resisting Nazi pressures, but in 48, the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia was too much for Kubelik, and he emigrated to the West and never went back. But when Heydrich, this is a weird story, I don't know about its truth, but it's a kind of a weirdly cute story, so I'll tell it anyhow, which was that the square in front of the Rudolfinum was called Smetana Square. Heydrich renamed it Mozartplatz. And then there were a number of statues of famous composers around the Rudolfinum auditorium, one of whom was Mendelssohn. So Heydrich ordered the removal of the Mendelssohn statue. Unfortunately, the workers didn't have a clue as to who Mendelssohn was, so they picked the guy with the biggest nose, who happened to be Wagner. So they carted off the statue of Wagner, and Heydrich was furious and made them put it back. However, Heydrich was assassinated by some Czech partisans who had flown in from London in June of 42, and Hitler was so furious at the assassination of him that he ordered a reprisal to anybody who was known to have assisted these assassins. And he decided, or somebody decided, that a village called Lidice was the nest of it. Turned out not to be true, but that didn't stop Hitler and the Nazis from going in there and slaughtering every male. Ultimately, 400 people died. They dug up the corpses in the funerals, in the graveyards, and burned them. They destroyed the town, razed it to the ground. one of the biggest horror stories of that time in the war. So we'll get back to Lidice in just a minute because there's a footnote to it. There also had been a number of interesting Czech composers in the interwar period, all of whom fell victim to the Nazis, or many of whom fell victim to the Nazis and are now being resurrected as part of this degenerate music, Entartete Kunst, Entartete Musik, revival that's going on all over the world. People like Haas and Krause and Schulhoff and Ullmann, all of whom never made it past 1945. One of the things that Kubelik did before he went west was to start the Prague Spring Festival, which remains a major festival of contemporary music. The major conductor of Czechoslovakia in that period was Václav Neumann, who conducted this orchestra from 68 to 90. As you perhaps recall, I happened to have been there doing my doctoral research for my Berkeley doctorate. To been in Europe in 68, and I passed through Prague during the so-called Prague Spring in 1968, when there was this brief moment of liberalization under Dubček. However, the tanks, Russian tanks, moved in a few weeks later and crushed it. So there wasn't much free Czech action until the collapse of communism. Okay, now, moving along, the Rudolfinum, by the way, was re-restored in 1992 during the later years of the first tenure of Jerzy Belohlavek, the conductor of this afternoon's performance, who led the orchestra from 90 to 92. Now, I told you this is sort of a do-si-do about German-Czech relations. The Germans have been very good about what they call Wiedergutmachung, or restoration of relations, of acceptance of guilt for the Nazi horrors, etc. I mean, for example, an enormous amount of reparations and money and support given to Israel, but also a lot of close connections to countries like Czechoslovakia. And one of the German conductors who was particularly active in all this was a man named Wolfgang Sawallisch, who led the Bavarian State Opera for a number of years, but who made a number of recordings, including a really starrily cast in terms of the solo roles performance of the Stabat Mater, which he did in conjunction with the 40th anniversary commemoration of the destruction of Lidice. So that was 42, and he did his concerts and the recording in 82. It's really a nice recording. But weirdly enough, and I don't know the full background, you could perhaps ask Mr. Belohlavich, but in 92 he left the Czech Philharmonic, went on to founded another orchestra in Prague, had a distinguished international career, and they hired another German named Gert Albrecht, who was not particularly well known. The story at the time was that they thought he was going to get him a Western record contract, which didn't really happen. Albrecht lasted only 3 years, but then they did a number of other people, and Belohlavek only really came back to the Czech Philharmonic as its music director. I think he was principal guest conductor from 2010 to 12, but he became the music director again just 2 years ago. But he is the best known Czech conductor. And in the service of Antonín Dvořák, the Czech Philharmonic under Belohlavek have inaugurated a series of recordings and television programs and so forth. So far it's the complete symphonies and concertos, but I'm sure they'll get to the choral work soon enough. And there's this tour, which has only 2 performances of the Stabat Mater here and in Northridge, but going over the country for the United States for 2 weeks, and has a number of pieces by Dvořák and Suk and so forth on it. So that is more or less my spiel on German-Czech relations. Dvořák may be the best-known Czech composer, if you don't count Smetana or Janáček, but his relationship to the Czech national impetus, which began in the mid-19th century and continued through to the founding of the Czech Republic in 1919, is not compromised, but enriched, if you wish, by the fact that he was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He did deserve a lot of his initial fame from Brahms, and that he is, in essence, whether you accept Botstein's notion of covert rebellion under overt concession, he is a Germanic-sounding composer. And I say that as a positive. I mean, I like German music. I have my doctorate in German cultural history. But so that is the context in which I think you might best listen to the Stabat Mater. It's a great Czech piece that sounds like a great German piece, and as such, it's just great. So thank you very much.